Good morning. Good morning. Welcome to the Richard Nixon Presidential Library and Museum. My name is Joe Lopez, Vice President of Marketing and Communications for the Richard Nixon Foundation. We're pleased to have you here today in Yorba Linda, and a special greeting to those of you watching on C-SPAN and YouTube today. Today's Nixon Legacy Forum is co-presented by the Richard Nixon Foundation and the Nixon Presidential Library, National Archives, and Records Administration. We've done more than 30 of these Nixon Legacy Forums over the past 10 years, and you can find all of them on our website, nixonfoundation.org. I'd like to start by introducing Jeff Shepard. Jeff served as Associate Director of the Domestic Council in the Nixon administration, and he's now a member of the Board of Directors of the Richard Nixon Foundation. Jeff, kick us off.
Thank you, Joe. I'm Jeff Shepard. Beginning in 2010, we began producing what we call Nixon Legacy Forums. And they're co-sponsored in the past by the Nixon Foundation and the National Archives. As today, they are usually recorded, videotaped by C-SPAN, and rebroadcast later on. What they are, in essence, are group oral histories. They bring together the documents that are maintained here by the National Archives and the people who produce them. We've done, contrary to Joe, we've done 40 of these Nixon Legacy Forums since 2010. And the Archives is particularly pleased with the work that we do because they say we make their documents come alive. And we do them here or we do them in Washington, D.C. We are the only administration producing such programs on various public policy initiatives of our administration. Today's forum is going to be moderated by Chris DeMuth to my right. He and I were there together. All the panelists were there at the time, but Chris and I were young colleagues on President Nixon's White House staff, and he worked for Patrick Moynihan on urban affairs, and then he chaired the White House Task Force on Environmental Policy. He then taught at Harvard's Kennedy School, and then came back under the Reagan administration and was, in essence, the deregulation czar at OMB. He spent 25 years at the American Enterprise Institute, including 22 years as its president. And then he spent a little over 10 years as a distinguished fellow at the Hudson Institute, and recently switched within the last year or so, where he's now a distinguished fellow on American thought at the Heritage Foundation. He's a close friend, he's an accomplished scholar, and we're most fortunate to have him here to moderate this Legacy Forum. Chris, it's all yours.
Jeff, thank you very much. And thank you to the Nixon Foundation and to the library for sponsoring this event and your good work in producing these forums over the years. Richard Nixon is best known for his achievements in foreign policy, but his initiatives in domestic policy were astonishingly innovative. In environmental, welfare, and healthcare policy, he was politically avant-garde, well ahead of his times. His school desegregation actions succeeded where others had failed. High on this list, and perhaps the most consequential of all, was communications policy. The revolution in human communication, which has given us the global internet, smartphones in every purse and pocket, hundreds of high-definition television channels, and that helped us survive the recent pandemic lockdowns, was launched in the Richard Nixon White House. When President Nixon took office, America had only 3 television networks, ABC, CBS, and NBC, whose nightly news programs the president thoroughly loathed. Cable television was nothing but long extension cords from antenna towers to homes in areas where the terrain interfered with home antennas. Telephones were hardwired through Ma Bell's vast highly expensive grid of landlines that made long-distance calls a high-priced luxury. The only recent innovation in telephones had been introducing the color phone as an alternative to the black telephone. Satellite communications was a sluggish, ridiculously disorganized monopoly that had managed to orbit one or two low-capacity units the size of a carry-on suitcase in nearly a decade. What launched the technological journey that brought us from 1970 to 2024 was a simple, radical idea that wireless communications through satellites and towers could replace all of those wires at far lower cost and in far greater variety, and that private enterprise and free market competition could do the job. But it was an idea that most engineers, business executives, and government officials did not see. And when they got wind of it, they fought to preserve the lethargic status quo. This is the story we will be exploring today. Another remarkable feature of Richard Nixon's presidency was the array of brilliant thinkers he attracted to the top ranks of his administration. Henry Kissinger, George Shultz, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, Arthur Burns, Herb Stein, and others. Less well known is Clay T. Whitehead, Tom, who conceived and headed the White House Office of Telecommunications Policy and assembled his own team of brainiacs, including Antonin Scalia, who would go on to become one of the greatest of all Supreme Court justices, and Brian Lamb, who would go on to found C-SPAN and become one of America's greatest civic educators. Tom died in 2008, just shy of 70, having lived to see the first fruits of his policy revolution. Steve Jobs had introduced the iPhone just a year and a half before, and having helped advance that revolution as a path-breaking satellite entrepreneur. His legacy lives on in his papers collected at the Library of Congress and the Nixon Library, and in the work of our three distinguished panelists. Margaret Whitehead was Tom's soulmate and his wife for 35 years. She was part of his creative adventures in engineering, economics, politics, and business on a daily basis. As a PhD cultural historian, she has been perfectly equipped to preserve and interpret the cultural transformation her husband ignited. Henry Goldberg was General Counsel of the Office of Telecommunications Policy following Antonin Scalia and was deeply involved in all of its initiatives. He went on to found the Washington law firm of Goldberg, Godless, Wiener and Wright, and is often described as the Dean of American telecommunications lawyers. In addition to his brilliant legal practice, he has authored many articles and reports on communications policy, the First Amendment and the media, and emerging communications technologies. Thomas Hazlett is Hugh H. Macaulay Professor of Economics and Director of the Information Economy Project at Clemson University. He is author of The Political Spectrum, The Tumultuous Liberation of Wireless Technology from Herbert Hoover to the Smartphone, and other influential books and hundreds of articles on communications policy, including regular columns for the Wall Street Journal and the Financial Times. The two Toms, Whitehead and Hazlett, were colleagues and collaborators in the 2000s when both held professorships at George Mason University. Let me say, as a longtime student of Professor Hazlett's work, that it towers above everything else that has been written in the field. Now for Margaret Whitehead. Margaret, the floor, or I should say, the airwaves, are yours.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Jim Byron, Jeff Shepard, the Nixon Presidential Library, and the Nixon Foundation for this opportunity to examine the history of OTP. And thank you, Chris, Henry, and Tom, for so generously sharing your universally acknowledged talents at this forum. In 1967, when the Hubert Humphrey campaign sought the name of an economic policy expert from the president of America's most modern think tank, RAND, he suggested the campaign engage RAND's 28-year-old economic analyst, Tom Whitehead. Afterward, when Humphrey's team approached him, Tom said, "I'm honored by your offer, but I am a Republican." Having said this, Tom thought to himself, if the Humphrey people want me, perhaps I might help Nixon. This thought changed Tom Whitehead's life. The story of Tom's path from the heartland to MIT, RAND, the Nixon White House, and later to pioneering entrepreneurship is especially American. Tom was born in 1938 and raised in a small Kansas town by parents trained as teachers and a father who was a government worker. On the edge of town, Tom's father, with young Tom's help, maintained a cattle farm. Major events in Tom's life at 12 were that he tested as having the highest IQ in the state of Kansas for his age, and his mother gave him her father's telegraph key. Key in hand, he bought a ham kit, built its radio, taught himself Morse code, and applied to the FCC for a ham radio license. To enable his global reach, Tom and his father saw to the installation of a telephone pole in their backyard, which Tom somehow miraculously climbed without safety gear to attach his wiring. His technology in place, he proceeded to cover his bedroom walls with the QSL cards from his ham contacts. Rhythmic sounds of Morse code's dots and dashes began to pervade the Whitehead household. In the early 1950s, an era when long-distance calls were expensive and international travel uncommon, Tom was captivated by the magic of expanding his imagined universe with his ham contacts and the research he did on their countries. This he did in 3 sets of prime reference books his family gave him as a reward for his academic achievements. Tom left Kansas at 18 to attend MIT, where after his first semester, the faculty required that all of his future courses be at the graduate level. In the ensuing 11 years spent between MIT and volunteer military service, Tom earned 3 graduate degrees. Among them, 1 was in electrical engineering and 2 more were in systems analysis and management. One of these degrees was a PhD. In addition to these 3 degrees, Tom had an all-but dissertation for a second PhD, one in economics. On proposing that he move forward with this to his mentor, the legendary Professor William Kaufman, Kaufman exclaimed, "Tom, you have done enough. For heaven's sake, you are prepared." Kaufman, famously a defense strategist and budgeteer, had not mentored Tom merely by teaching him, but by inserting him in the work cultures of Bell Labs, the Bureau of the Budget, and RAND. After MIT, Tom worked at RAND for a year before calling Bob Ellsworth, a former chairman of the Republican Party in Kansas who was close to Nixon. Through him, Tom was able to join Nixon's top campaign advisors in New York. Later, when drafted by the Nixon transition team for 6 months, Tom's unique credentials prompted a unanimous request from the team that he be responsible for the 6 science agencies reporting to the president. Among these were the Atomic Energy Commission, NASA, and the Federal Communications Commission. Once in the White House and eventually nominated by the president and confirmed by the Senate as a special assistant, he dealt with all 6 agencies, but realized, as he had for some time, that the most burning issues, ones not addressed by the prior administration, were those in telecom. Tom had begun to research the difficulties and possibilities in telecom even before entering the White House. Delving deeply, he deemed these issues broad and deep enough to warrant policy analysis by an independent agency within the executive branch. Approving Tom's proposal for this agency, the Office of Telecommunications Policy, President Nixon signed an executive order to launch it. Afterward, disappointed in not finding the able candidate he had envisioned to head OTP, Tom finally took the job himself. In 1970, at the age of 31, he was nominated by the president and confirmed by the Senate as director of OTP. The immensely talented people Tom drew to OTP, Nino Scalia, Henry Goldberg, Brian Lamb, Bruce Owen, and Dale Hatfield, were each fundamental to today's topic, OTP's transformation of telecom in the U.S. and, as a result, international telecom. OTP allowed these brilliant people, in one way or another, to partake of a reformed understanding of the technical, legal, and media aspects of telecom. OTP's mantra, many voices, was present in all of this. Nino Scalia went on to be an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court, Henry Goldberg to establish the signature telecom law firm catering to the flourish of new telecom businesses, and Brian Lamb founded the groundbreaking major cable network C-SPAN, for which he won the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Bruce Owen gained an even greater distinction in academia. Dale Hatfield continued to operate as an agent of significant reform in government, and Tom went on to become a national and international telecom pioneer. Among his achievements was designing and founding what today is still the largest satellite company in the world. Besides engaging these brilliant colleagues, Tom achieved what he did at OTP because he was blessed with an extraordinarily good nature, intellect, and country. Most especially, he was blessed by Richard Nixon's trusting support for OTP's creation and its policies of reform.
Margaret, thank you very much. We will turn now to Henry Goldberg. Henry?
Thank you. Thank you, Margaret, for the kind words. Yes, you described the Tom Whitehead that I knew. Let me go back to something that Chris opened up with, and that is the state of the telecom industry in the United States when Richard Nixon took the oath of office. It was terrible. We had one company called AT&T that provided all telecom services in the United States except for video. And more than that, they provided all the consumer equipment that was used on the AT&T network. So AT&T gave you a phone. Sometimes it was black, sometimes, as Chris said, it was color, but you had no choice. That was your phone. On the video side, again, as Chris said, we had 3 national TV networks. Some would say 2.5, but they called themselves 3. There were local broadcast stations, and there was that rudimentary cable industry that more properly was called the community antenna television system that did make for clearer signals from the TV broadcast stations. There was a third element, and that was the federal government in the form of a regulatory agency, the Federal Communications Commission. Federal Communications Commission in those days viewed itself as protecting AT&T's monopoly and assuring that there was no competition to national television networks, particularly from cable. So what happened? What happened was the Nixon administration. And as Chris called it, a revolution, yes, a revolution resulted. And it was a revolution that was based on the notion that rather than have a nationalized telecom system heavily regulated, that there was more of a role for private enterprise and more of a role for competition. This revolution in the early 1970s planted the seeds for the telecommunications industry that we have today. Yes, I'm saying that there is a direct causative line between the Nixon administration's telecom initiatives and the incredible telecommunications that we have today with more choice than consumers can handle and more equipment than we can afford. What does it relate to? How did this happen? Well, it happened with the Nixon administration and the president's choice of Tom Whitehead, a visionary, to lead it. And this made all the difference in the world. Tom believed, like the president, that a competitive marketplace was much better equipped and much more motivated to welcome the new technology that was on the horizon. The technology had not been fully formed, but Tom saw its potential. So while OTP had this visionary as its head and the support of the Nixon administration, what it didn't have was many of the tools necessary in Washington to make its weight felt. It had no authority over non-federal telecom in the United States. It had no oversight over the Federal Communications Commission. What it did have was what's called the bully pulpit of the White House. And OTP could gain currency and support for its views through introducing legislation, which we did, through Tom Whitehead's speeches and his congressional appearances. And of course, it had the benefit of the backing from the Nixon White House. So the first battle in this revolution involved satellite technology. And Whitehead perceived that satellite technology could be a very disruptive force in the existing telecom structure. But until Whitehead came along, satellite technology could not disrupt anything. Satellite technology in the early 60s was buried internationally in a legal monopoly called Intelsat, which was a UN treaty organization. So putting a disruptive technology in the UN treaty organization, you know what you're going to get. Nothing. So in the late 60s, the proposal was made that domestic satellite technology would be put into the same monopoly straitjacket that Intelsat had placed satellite technology internationally. So to unleash satellites' disruptive nature, Whitehead came up with what he called the open skies policy. This was a policy that said any financially and technically qualified private company could put up a satellite and provide satellite national, international connections. This was a stroke of genius. I also like the fact that he called it open skies. Who could object to open skies? The success of the open skies policy was, I can't say immediate, but it certainly was prompt. And it encouraged private companies to get into the satellite business. And because there was competition among them, the charges for their nationwide interconnection were much lower than AT&T was charging, and encouraged the development of new cable program networks, HBO, ESPN, Ted Turner's various networks, and yes, of course, C-SPAN. But the open skies policy significance was much greater than just satellite video distributed programming, because it proved the hitherto controversial notion that you could serve national interests and consumers' interests with a privatized, competitive private market. And this made all the difference in the world. So that was foundational for OTP, and I think for the country. The next task that OTP set for itself was to deal with cable television. And even though the name of our office was Telecommunications Policy, this cable venture started without any regard to policy whatsoever. I mean, Whitehead had the notion that the development of cable was the best way to compete with and really to reduce the power of the three national TV broadcast networks. That had nothing to do with the policy. The thing that was holding up cable development was a government policy that stifled its development. There was something called the cable freeze. The FCC actually had adopted this freeze to halt any future development of cable because there were unresolved copyright issues, and the broadcasters strongly opposed the competition from cable, who brought in out-of-market or distant signals to compete with them in the market. So the first thing that OTP set itself to do, without regard to policy, was to end the cable freeze. And for this, Whitehead put Antonin Scalia in charge, and Nino took a very old-fashioned approach, which was, let's lock everyone in a room and keep them there until they agreed on a compromise. And the parties that were locked into the room were the broadcasters, the cable companies, Hollywood, and, surprise of all, the Federal Communications Commission. Well, under that kind of pressure and Nino's forceful personality, the parties ended up agreeing to a compromise. And that ended the cable freeze, and that set the path for cable development, which was OTP's objective in the first place. So having shelved the cable policy to get the cable freeze over, Whitehead then turned to creating a long-term policy for cable. And this came in the form of a cabinet committee on cable television. And yes, it was the Nixon administration's cabinet. It was staffed and led by OTP. And in looking around and thinking about a policy, a long-term policy for cable, the cabinet committee realized that because cable was essentially a local monopoly, I mean, it was authorized under municipal franchising, city by city, the realization was that you really weren't going to have competition among these local cable systems. But contrary to the hardware, the cable programming market could be open and free and competitive. The only problem was that, and the fear was that the power of the cable owner, the cable operator over the pipeline would restrict program content on the cable networks. So the solution for the cabinet committee was to forbid vertical integration between ownership of the cable pipeline and ownership and control over the programming that appeared on that pipeline. So we called this the separations policy. Others less charitably called it the common carrier policy. And it was controversial. And as I look back on the debate about that policy and what happened when the cabinet committee report was released, it sounded very familiar to me and those of us who were involved more recently on the battle of control of the internet called net neutrality. And the same elements of that discussion on the cable policy back in the mid-1970s, to me, were echoed in the net neutrality fight. So the separations policy was adopted by the cabinet committee. We at OTP drafted legislation to implement that, and we submitted the legislation to Capitol Hill, where it died a very quick death as the cable lobbyists opposed it. Strongly is not even strong enough word. And they convinced the FCC that the separations policy, if adopted, would kill investment in cable systems. So I guess having succeeded with the cable compromise and ending the cable freeze, but not doing so well on a long-term cable policy, OTP turned. I don't mean to make this sound sequential because there was always an undercurrent. The next thing that OTP did and accomplished was nothing less than the breakup of the AT&T monopoly. OTP over its few years certainly encouraged competition to AT&T, and we nurtured the private companies, the startups like MCI that were starting to compete with AT&T. However, the CEO of AT&T, the then president John DeMuth, drew the line in the sand and made a speech declaring war on competition against AT&T services. Well, that was all that OTP had to hear because we were itching to do this for years. But it was the DeMuth speech that gave us, I can't say excuse, but gave us the cause to move very quickly to counter it. And what did we do? Whitehead and Bruce Owen and others at OTP convinced the White House that what was needed was a new antitrust suit against AT&T. And OTP worked with the Justice Department and went back and convinced them to open an antitrust case against AT&T. There had been an earlier one that was halted with a consent decree back in the 1950s, but this consent decree really didn't stop AT&T from its overbearing monopolist practices. So a new antitrust suit was generated, and it took a couple of years, but the result of that antitrust suit was the breakup of Ma Bell and the AT&T system. So another, in my view, great success for OTP. So that's about all I wanted to focus on for OTP, but I did want to go back to one thing. I said there was a direct line between the Nixon administration's initiatives in telecom and the telecom industry we have today. There's another aspect to that, maybe for a future forum, Jeff, that the change in the US telecom industry led to the change in the international telecommunications industry. And if it hasn't become fully privatized, it certainly was denationalized. That's a subject for a future discussion. Thanks.
Henry, thank you very much. Tom Hazlett.
Well, this really does take us back, and the comments of Henry Goldberg obviously are quite well informed. He was there, by the way. I'll just say that not all of the panelists were there during the Nixon administration, but if I had been eligible to vote, sure, I would have been happy to participate. But the comment that struck me too is that what a mess telecommunications was in 1969. At the same time, there was no question that the United States was far ahead of any other country. And one of the ironies here is that, yes, there were a lot of challenges in the US, and we knew it. We knew things weren't working as they might. We had a lot of opportunities that we were not taking advantage of. But you look around the world, and there was no model. Nobody was doing it better. In fact, all our peer countries were lost in state monopolies. So you go to British Telecom or NTT in Japan or Deutsche Telekom. These were countries that not only had monopoly, they had state monopolies and no chance to jump ahead into a competitive world given their current structure. So it wasn't as if people could say, look, let's do what they're doing in Canada or the UK or Australia, and we'll jump right ahead. These market models were not out there, and people had to think outside the box. And every time you do that, of course, you bump into the immediate question, how do you know it's going to work? Well, you don't know it's going to work, obviously, if you don't see that kind of evidence at home or abroad. You've got to think hard about the problem. You've got to become very well informed as the particulars of the industry. And there doesn't seem to be anything more complicated than telecommunications as an industry. So these kinds of questions were not exactly conversation starters. They put an end to what could happen. In fact, sort of a joke around the Federal Communications Commission for years is somebody has a bright idea of some innovative path to follow, and the answer always comes down from the top. Can't do it. Why not? Technical reasons. Technical reasons seems to cover everything. I always love it when lawyers who have no idea what the technology is say technical reasons, and the follow-up is, well, what are those technical reasons? We have to talk to the engineering department. They're at a conference in Las Vegas this week, but they'll be back. So this is the way the system works. It's got challenges. We know things might be better, but what are they? And it's very difficult not just to answer simple questions about what we might want instead. It's painfully difficult politically to advance a new marketplace. And so this is the situation we're in 1969. Just think about the phone network. It was a monopoly. It was a private monopoly. It was very advanced in terms of what the technologies were. We had Bell Labs, undoubtedly the greatest center of innovation in telecommunications and computer technology in the world at that time. But they had what was deemed a monopoly, and in many respects was quashing all attempts at competition, although there were little green shoots coming up, MCI, using wireless technology to sort of, they got in on a gimmick in the 1960s. This is before a little bit about what we're talking about, but they actually sort of snuck in just providing, they got permission to do point-to-point wireless communications, just here and there, just to the side of the telecommunications network that AT&T controlled. They wouldn't destroy anything, they wouldn't hurt anything, just a little bit on the side. And actually, through strategic manipulation of the permissions that were sought, MCI did an amazing thing and kind of snuck into head-to-head direct competition in long distance. That was sort of on the outside. There were little tiny efforts like this. This was resisted, of course, by AT&T, that did everything it could to resist. I might just recall that in 1957, the Federal Communications Commission, our public interest regulators, actually stopped a company that for 30 years had been selling a device called Hushaphone. Hushaphone, and you should Google this really on images and go back to the 1920s, 30s, 40s when they sold. These were devices, physical devices you could put on a phone, so that if you were in a cubicle at work and people were close by and could listen to your phone call, this device that came out around the phone and around your head would sort of muffle the call so you could speak privately. It had no electronics to it, but it was an attachment to the phone, according to AT&T. And AT&T had tariffs that prohibited that product from being sold in the United States because it would threaten the integrity of the telephone network. Now, that's not the funny part. The funny part is the regulator that had a mandate to actually treat AT&T as a common carrier that everybody could use on equal terms and conditions actually said, yes, AT&T is right. And for the first time, a court took put that argument through some real scrutiny and found that that was too far. The FCC was out of control here. AT&T was exercising more monopoly than they needed, and Hushaphone could sell its product. That was overturned by the court. A very similar case got to court again in 1968 called Carter Phone. And at that point, AT&T still insisted that a device that did have some electronics but didn't impact the phone network, took your phone calls and then actually sent them wirelessly to others, that would, AT&T thought that was a problem, they shouldn't be able to do it. It was a tiny bit of competition, but competition too much. The FCC actually took the other side on that and said as long as there's a protocol here that this attachment can use the network without possibly disturbing anything that AT&T might do. It should be legal. And that was a big step forward. That was, in many renditions, many histories, this was an inflection point. People were starting to think that maybe a little bit of competition might work. But still you had AT&T, massively 90% of revenues in telecommunications, and monopolies really everywhere else for the final 10%, except some rounding error. Where was cellular in 1969? You say, well, cellular hadn't been invented yet. Well, that's actually incorrect. The right answer is 1945. Coming out of World War II at Bell Labs, we had the cellular concepts and the architecture drawn up. It took all those years to move spectrum allocations into the new competing technology because AT&T was really just not that interested in a new structure they didn't think was going to generate much for them, and they certainly didn't want it to generate much for others. So cellular was just sitting there nascent, no competition to the existing system. Cable television. You might think cable hadn't been invented. Well, wrong again. We've had cable radio since the 1920s, cable television in the United States since 1948. And what happened to cable was that regulators took a look, and in the 1960s, actually it passed at the federal level, they had passed on doing anything about cable. It was just delivering over-the-air broadcast signals to outlying areas that couldn't get the broadcast. It didn't really harm broadcasters. It wasn't competitive. It was complementary. But starting in the 1960s, you actually had some cities like San Diego, California, that microwaved television TV stations into San Diego and gave San Diego customers a chance for $5 a month to subscribe to a product that would compete with local San Diego channels. Well, that was the red, that was the red alarm, and the word went up that cable should be suppressed because it was going to compete with broadcasting. Now, the real trick on this is what was happening to broadcast regulation in 1962, in 1961. May 9th, 1961, you all remember that day. That was the moment of the most famous speech ever given by a U.S. regulator. According to who? According to me. You can disprove this, perhaps. And that was?
Newton Minow.
Newton Minow, the vast wasteland, chairman of the FCC, stands up in front of the National Association of Broadcasters, the executives and owners of TV stations in America, and says, I challenge you to watch your own product. Sit in front of a television from dawn to dusk, and you'll find an unending series of ridiculous sitcoms and lousy westerns and car chases and endless commercials. You have created a vast wasteland, and you're doing this with access to the publicly owned radio spectrum. I'm going to go back to Washington, and I'm going to create new forms, new renewal forms that'll make it tougher for you to keep your stations unless you give something back to the public in terms of some real quality programming. So this was the vast wasteland. It was actually a vast wasteland, even in Newton Minow's terms, because of FCC licensing policy. We only had 3 networks, only had enough licenses for 3 networks. And you say, well, where are we going to get a 4th network? Where could that possibly come from? Well, again, wrong. We actually had a 4th network in the early 1950s on experimental licenses. And some of you know the name of that network.
DuPont.
DuMont. Yeah, the DuMont network. The creators of the Honeymooners, by the way, very innovative in some things, programming, for one. But at any rate, there were only enough licenses for 3 networks. DuMont screened Bloody Murder when the licensing plan came out, the big one in 1952, and put them off the air, left the triopoly. And with this kind of organizational structure, it's very hard for niche programming and competition to develop. And sure enough, there was lowest common denominator programming, exactly what Newton Minow was calling out in 1961. But starting literally the following year, 1962, the FCC took a hardline position not against the vast wasteland, but defending the vast wasteland by attacking cable competition. And in a series of rulings, 62 through 1970, bing, 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 one right after the other, suppressed the building and operation of cable television systems to actually compete with cable. And that's why we didn't get cable in the 60s and 70s until the deregulation of cable, which now, would anybody look at television and call it the vast wasteland today? Thousands of choices for customers, an entirely new market. Then it was virtually nothing. It was a very tight oligopoly, very little choice. And which way to go on that? Satellites were an exciting new technology, really exciting. That was space-age stuff, literally. And in 1962, in the excitement, during the Kennedy administration, there had been the Communications Satellite Act that created a government monopoly, ComSat, which wanted to take advantage of our lead in private sector technology, so gave essentially half the shares in the corporation to AT&T. And it was this public-private partnership to send out these communication satellites and move us forward. Chris mentioned that very little happened. There were all kinds of disputes in the organizational structure, questions about what they really could do to compete in the market. But we were stymied by this government monopoly. We had the amazing head start. We knew a lot about space. We were the leaders, but we weren't using it. We could go on and cite some of the other things that we have today that weren't happening. You can get a real good handle on this by reading a wonderful report written just prior to the Nixon administration, the so-called Rostow report, submitted in December of 1968 on the communications marketplace. And it's talking about all the great technology that's changing the landscape, but hasn't been allowed to be deployed, hasn't been used to really deliver services to the public. What are we going to do? They talk about using more competition. They even use words like deregulation. But at the same time, every time there's one step contemplated, they're always talking about, but monopoly is going to have to exist for many, if not most, services. Because for satellite, it seemed this huge expense had to be a natural monopoly. AT&T, one system, one policy, universal service. That was an AT&T corporate slogan, and it was an FCC policy. You couldn't do it with competition. Natural monopolies everywhere. Let's see if there's any place we can do any little bit of competition. That's the world that Tom Whitehead walked into during that early Nixon administration. And if I could just say this about Tom, he was benefited by several things. One, he did have an MIT degree, and it almost didn't matter if he had learned anything at MIT. He was the MIT guy. And when people said, this is about science and new technology, they looked at Tom Whitehead and said, well, he knows about it, but we don't. And he was given a portfolio way beyond his experience and way beyond his years that served him well. And he was able to think the things that were verboten elsewhere in that political discussion. You go to the Rostow report, they're talking about all the things that have to happen before you have competition in something like satellite. And I think Tom skipped a lot of that report and just got the part that said competition. And when he did Open Skies in 1972, he didn't do all the studies and qualifications for where the competition could go.
Pilot programs.
It was supposed to take decades. In fact, they say that in the Rostow report. This is going to take decades. In 1972, there was an open skies policy. The FCC wasn't thinking anything about it. Tom Whitehead somehow influenced this longtime lifer at the FCC, who was chairman of the commission at that time, go for it. And he was impressive enough that this young 30-something MIT grad talked him into it. And within a couple of years, there were 6 competitors in the satellite business. Now, again, we're not satellite customers directly in 1975 when this is all happening, but Brian Lamb, who founded C-SPAN, was. And Brian Lamb will tell you that before competition in satellite, it would cost C-SPAN $15 million an hour for video programming to be transmitted to the 30,000 cable system head ends across America. To do national programming was expensive just because of the monopoly holdup in satellite. After Open Skies, by the middle 1970s, C-SPAN was able to launch at $100 an hour. That's 150,000 times reduction because of opening the market. And it wasn't nuanced, it wasn't experimental, it didn't take decades, it got into the market quickly. An entire cable industry was then, in fact, deregulated, allowed to compete, largely because they were viable and there was something there. There are hundreds of channels competing with what was supposed to be only 3, according to FCC regulation. And the world changed. And as Henry brings up quite appropriately, it wasn't just that opening competition in satellite worked to stimulate economic growth. It was the proof of concept. There was no more obvious tough market than satellites, with its huge upfront, its high technology, its massive national and international scale in terms of the idea of monopoly. In 1970, the FCC actually, after all those years where cellular technology sat nascent, it actually created its first notice with rules for what could be the coming cellular industry. And in that proceeding, it said, cellular has to be a natural monopoly. And therefore, we will only issue 1 license per market. And in fact, to make sure that license is okay and viable to provide service to the public, we will make sure we issue that license to an affiliate of AT&T. Couldn't just be any old licensee, had to be AT&T. So it had to be part of the old monopoly to become part of a new monopoly. That's how embedded in old thinking we were, and it shows you how radical was the notion of Tom Whitehead to take an industry, looks like a monopoly, might be competition, let's let competition and do the experiment. Now, the FCC doesn't like to rush into anything, and they finally got to this opinion in 1970, but of course immediately reconsidered. 1974, they said, wow, maybe we went a little too fast on that. We'll allow 2 into the market. It took another 10 years, by the way, to start issuing licenses through all the fights and AT&T, Motorola, other interests were involved there. But this radical notion that competition could save the day and chaos was not the automatic result, and that it wasn't just about knowing all the science or knowing all the economic outcomes to start with. It's having some good solid principles, doing your best shot, and allowing the market to experiment that might get you to the next step and really deliver benefits for free speech, for consumers, and technology. And in that, Tom Whitehead is absolutely an American hero, a pioneer who I think was helped by his young, brash naivete and the fact that he did study the science and not get intimidated by the questions that were asked.
Tom, thank you very much. Margaret, Henry, Tom, thank you for those wonderful presentations. I'd like to begin starting with Margaret and Henry. If you have any further comments based on what your co-panelists have said. And beware, if you go, I've got some tough questions for all of you.
I would just like to add that one of the exciting days in my life, looking back at all of this, is when Tom Whitehead came home from the White House one night, and he just kept saying over and over again, hundreds of channels, hundreds of channels. And I wondered what in the world he was talking about.
Henry?
I certainly don't disagree with anything that Tom Margaret has said. It comes down to a very simple thing in my mind, and that is Tom Whitehead set out to change the world and succeeded. And that's the world we have today.
Tom, shall I go ahead?
Yeah, I'll pick up on one little firecracker that Henry put out, and that was that the cable report, the Cabinet Cable Report 1974, led by OTP, it did advocate that there be a ban between the cable operator serving local households with video and then owning the video that they put out there, so that if you're Time Warner and you have Time Warner Cable delivering cable service, that you can't also own CNN and other Time Warner properties. That was a mistake, just in terms of the correct policy. It was picked up by net neutrality, because net neutrality is an extension of the error. We've done fine without explicit rules and do much better when there's a competition among business models. And we get a lot of neutrality in networks, and we get some non-neutrality in networks. And it seems, particularly with a competitive environment, to work out. But I believe that and Henry may want to comment on it, I believe that the feeling at the time was that cable was in such a compromised situation politically, and had broadcasters on the one side, AT&T on the other, both powerful, established incumbent interests pushing against any allowance of cable, that the idea of the Cabinet Committee report was to forge some kind of political compromise that cable would be allowed to come in but not own its own programming. Let me just say, as an economic or theoretical matter, this is crazy. You've got broadcasters already in the market, dominating 100% market share, essentially. You've got the powerful AT&T monopoly on the other, and you're trying to get this new startup industry, cable TV, to invest capital to bring a new infrastructure, Wire America, very expensive. These were called the cowboys of the industry. They didn't have Wall Street support and so forth. The headquarters of cable was Denver, back in the days when Denver was a dusty little western town. And these were the entrants. The entrants don't have any market power. There's no issue that has to be dealt with stopping them from forcing their programming on customers. We want them in the market. We want all the efficiencies of allowing them to make the choice. Do we need to own this programming, or do we do it on our own? And owning the programming, obviously a lot of innovators in cable have been cable operators. They tried to get programming that people wanted. I mean, one of the examples, by the way, is the nonprofit called C-SPAN. C-SPAN is owned by the cable operators. Early on in the industry, the cable operators wanted something distinct, some programming that was as distinct as C-SPAN, and that was why they supported C-SPAN. It's why they still support C-SPAN. So the integration of the programming is absolutely efficient in most situations. We have antitrust laws to pick out the special case where it's not. And I think that inclusion is a very interesting inclusion. It goes against the open market idea. It was a regulatory idea that was unnecessary. It copied from common carriage that was applied to AT&T and so forth, and seems like to me, it sticks out like a sore thumb. It seems to be a political compromise that really would not have been made if the political circumstances were different.
Chris, could I ask a question?
Okay, may I respond to that? I couldn't disagree more with Tom. And if it were a political decision by Tom and the Cabinet Committee report, It was absolutely the wrong political decision because when the report was issued, the roof fell in and lobbyists for the cable industry, not the shrinking violet cable industry, but the cable industry that hired high-powered lobbyists, killed it. It's still a good idea if you talk to people trying to fight with Apple over the App Store and the control that they have running the App Store and what apps are permitted, or on the other side of Google, the power of the, if you want to call it an essential facility, whether it's a cable system or an app store or the internet, you've got to be sure that the ones running that facility are not using their power over that facility to stifle programming. And look, the best programming now on TV does not come from the cable industry, qua cable industry, which bought old broadcast properties, but from the Netflix of the world. So with that, I'll just disagree with Tom and stop talking.
I want to add something that I think is important to Henry's account of the open skies policy. He emphasized that the policy consisted of saying very simply, any private organization, firm, that puts together the technological wherewithal, the financing, the organizational ability to actually launch and put into orbit a communications satellite may do so. Government will not stop you. That was pretty hard to oppose, and it was a wonderfully simple idea, but there was a second part to it that I want to mention that I think was terribly important. We're not going to subsidize any of you guys. You're on your own. You have to do it all yourselves, and if you fail, don't come crying to us for a bailout. It's completely private sector. This is not a government-private sector partnership. This is simply permissive. So it was very different, for example, from today's federal policy toward electric cars and an electric car infrastructure, where it is heavily subsidized in 5 different directions. If any firm gets in trouble, the government's going to be there for you. It's going to help you out with this, that, and the other thing. There was none of that at all. The result was, you would think, well, that would have suppressed things. Just the opposite. It was because everybody knew that they were going to succeed or fail on their own that they concentrated so heavily on the technology in the early days that they were able to put up several satellites just in a few years that were far more sophisticated and reliable than anything that had come before. Were there failures? Certainly. Failures are how you learn. Those were the pilot projects that led us to such rapid progress. I have a question for 2 of our panelists, and then Jeff Shepard has a question. I was in, with Jeff, I was in the Nixon White House. I was down the hall and around the corner from Tom Whitehead. I was doing things that were completely different. I didn't have any idea what this nice fellow was up to. I left to go to law school, and shortly after I got there, this would have been in 1971, I started reading speeches by this nice man proposing in public for the first time the ideas we've been discussing. And I just want to emphasize the radicalism of what was going on. He sounded like some eccentric, half-crazed college professor, except he was this very cool, collected, understated young man. And this was coming out of the Nixon White House? I mean, it was inconceivable to me. I couldn't understand what in the world was happening. And then, within a year or 2, he overcame the objections of the FCC, the television networks, the Pentagon, the Commerce Department, AT&T, and he triumphed over all of them. So I want to ask, Margaret, you said that he would come home and muse about hundreds of television channels in an era where there are only 3, and it seemed inconceivable there could be 4. And I want to know, in public, he was so cool. You know, if we open this up, maybe somebody might launch a satellite. Very, you know, he kind of understated everything. Was he the radical revolutionary at home, over the dinner table or at the breakfast table when he's suiting up to take the world? Was he really the cool engineer, or was he the hot revolutionary? And I want to ask Henry, what was going on in the White House? We had a lot of very straight-laced, proper, conservative senior staffers, and Richard Nixon in the Oval Office. What were they thinking? And how did you guys work with them and form an alliance that succeeded? Margaret?
Well, Tom was neither the hot under the collar revolutionary or very loud in any way. He was quiet. He was thoughtful. He was never confrontational. In fact, seldom confrontational. And it was fascinating to watch his policy career. It was filled with potential horrible conflicts and so much controversy among companies and large companies, and potentially in the White House. It was so interesting to me, and I think the reason I emphasized so much is 2 things in my remarks. Was there were 2 things at work here. One is this: we have this person who's from Kansas, who's raised in Kansas, who was a Democrat with a little d, from the heart to his brain, who worked on a cattle farm, who saw people in the local community, and had 3 sisters and friends and lovely parents. And then you cap that off with this magnificent education at MIT of reasoning and decision-making and management. And I think the result was very interesting. He was not radical in any way, except in his intellectual decisions about how the administration should proceed in dealing with all of these businesses. And there was a very amusing moment, which really sort of speaks to all of this, when he went to see the chairman of AT&T, who had refused to come to Washington to see him, claiming he would only come to Washington to see the president, which was fine with Tom. Tom said, "Fine, I'll come. I'd be delighted to come and see you." And he went there, and he began to tell the chairman of AT&T that after 20 minutes of pleasant conversation, that the White House was hoping, the president was hoping, to deregulate AT&T. Well, the president went into, let's just say he was exercised. I won't go into detail. And he finished his remarks by saying, "Who are you to deregulate my telephone company? You probably never even climbed a telephone pole." And Tom said, "As a matter of fact, I have, and I've climbed one of yours." So Tom was from the heartland. He had this magnificent education, and it just made for a very interesting mix of values and approaches.
Thank you, Margaret.
Let me
Henry.
add one thing to that. Tom certainly didn't look like a typical 1960s revolutionary. There's no doubt about that. But in his heart, he was. And if he came against the status quo that he thought was not working well or not doing the right thing, he took up arms against that status quo in telecom, but also in the ban on kite flying in the District of Columbia. He fought that battle too. But he was at heart revolutionary, particularly when what had to be overturned was something that was unfair, wrong-headed, and just not doing what it should do. So to get to your other question about how did that revolutionary manage things at the White House? Well, I don't really have firsthand knowledge. I mean, Tom kind of sheltered a lot of us at OTP from what was going on in the White House. But one thing that I suspect is that, at least initially, some of Tom's revolutionary ideas fit in with the president's ideas of what was wrong with the 3 national broadcast networks. And when Tom said, look, my initiatives, whether they're satellite or whether they're cable, we are going to cut back on the power of those networks. We are going to permit competition with them. And I think that resonated, not for policy reasons, but maybe for political or personal reasons with the White House. The only initiative that OTP took that really didn't fit that mold was breaking up AT&T. And I have no idea how he convinced the White House to go ahead with the antitrust suit.
Thank you, Henry. And I should say that what you just said comports with the understanding that I gained over the years from talks with Tom and several people that had been at the White House and involved in these debates, that there were a lot of debates. And at the senior level in the White House, there were people that did not understand what Tom was doing and were opposed to them and were taking calls from entrenched interests and were very worried about it. I think the secret to success is that Tom had an ally in the Oval Office. I think that Richard Nixon knew what he was up to, thought it was worth the risks, had his back, and at every time that it came into the Oval Office, it was decided in a way that let Tom and you and Brian and Nino Scalia continue with your work. Jeff Shepard.
Well, I have thank you, Chris. I have an observation and a question. I think it was on this very stage when that same comment was made about the all-volunteer Army, when Marty Anderson was working on the idea of ending the draft, and everybody was against it. And as Marty pointed out, he had an ally. The ally was in the Oval Office. And Nixon, in time after time after time, comes across as innovative and open to new ideas. And one of the wonderful reasons for these forums is to record and get that out. So my question then is revelatory of my own shortcomings. This hour has been hugely informative, and we've gone through open skies and deregulation of cable and breaking up of AT&T. And I was on the White House staff during this time. I didn't necessarily work in this area at all. But this is huge news to me, and the background is news. And my question of the group, where can someone like me go to learn more, to read about this? Because I'm spinning on the tales that you're telling.
Well, I will get the ball rolling. In this building, we can go and look at many papers in the Nixon Library. Thanks to Margaret's efforts and foresight by the leadership of the Library of Congress, Tom's papers are collected there. Moreover, they are all digitized and online and available at www.claytwhitehead.com. And I recommend that. And there are many videos of conversations, photographs, as well as papers. And it's just wonderful. And let me ask if Henry, Tom, Margaret, do you have any other recommendations? Okay, I'm going to something to tell us a little bit about a television show now on Apple TV and Netflix, When Wire Was King. What's that all about, Margaret?
Well, it's so interesting that Jennifer Manners, who was an award-winning documentary filmmaker, but also of the senior vice president of the fourth largest satellite company in the world, found that she had a gift for documentary filmmaking and won an award at Sundance and Cannes. And she's made a second film, having worked at the FCC. She has made a second film about the run-up to wireless, which very much includes OTP. And she didn't know about Tom. Tom has not had a lot of press in spite of all of these innovations. And she found out she knew Henry, and she went to Henry, and Henry helped her with her storyline because he certainly knows it well. He was part of it, and he was determinative to it. And I provided her the physical papers that she needed to make the film, and it's just thrilling. It's an absolutely fabulous film, and it's actually out now, and it's going to be streaming. It's going to be streaming, and it is out, When Wire Was King. And it's extremely entertaining. It's a wonderful story about our country and about public policy.
Half documentary, very, very well produced, with a lot of fascinating old footage of the Ma Bell telephone system. Even has a few Lily Tomlin jokes in it, for those of you who are old enough to remember Lily Tomlin. And a lot of wonderful documentary evidence of what we've been discussing, especially the AT&T antitrust case. Let me mention one other, which is what I mentioned at the very beginning, and that is Professor Hazlett's book, The Political Spectrum. It's the best book that's been written on the question. And if you read it, you will become an aficionado of all of his articles and studies that are available at his Clemson website. I'm going to, Chris, I'd like to look around and see. I think we have time for maybe one question, if there are any from the audience.
Yep, we have time for just a couple of questions right here.
Yeah, hi, my name is Mike Ebbing. I came to the Nixon White House in August 1970 as a member of White House Communications Agency, also known as WACA, which I'm sure most of you panelists are familiar with. Our mission at that time, as it is today, is to provide communications support for the office of the president. I look back at 1970 as the prehistoric days of communication and presidential communications. 3 months after I arrived with WACA, I was sent to Paris, November 1970, for de Gaulle's funeral. Probably one of the most challenging trips that I was on with the president. Worldwide leaders, we got to Paris. We gutted out one of our hotel rooms that we were staying at. That became basically the Paris White House. Our switchboard was up and operational within a few hours. And I remember, I don't know how they did it, but when I was working the switchboard, we had what we called long haul trunk lines back to the White House. I was a broadcast journalism major, University of Iowa, unlike Tom Whitehead, who had his degree at MIT. So I had no idea how it worked, but it was fascinating that I could take a switchboard cord, plug it into a hole, push a button, and within seconds, I would be connected to either the White House signal switchboard in the basement of the White House or the White House admin board, which was next door in the EOB building. So that just amazed me that kind of technology, which now I call prehistoric. But I would argue that the United States was among the worldwide leaders as far as providing presidential support. So it's fascinating to me that at the same time I was in the White House, that this brain power was going on with the Tom Whiteheads, and all of this was evolving. So I just make that as an observation, and I agree with Jeff, what an enlightening viewpoint this was to learn about all of this that had taken place while I was actually also working in the White House.
Wonderful,
Two
wonderful.
quick
Thank you very much.
observations, if I could. There was something called the London Switch, which I think was a dedicated military cable under the, and you remember you used to have to make an appointment to make a long distance call, and you know, your slot is 4 minutes at 2 a.m., and you could hardly hear on the other end of the line. But man, if you could connect through that London Switch, it was like the person was sitting next to you. It was clear as a bell and instantaneous and reserved for very special people. If you were senior enough on the White House staff, you got a phone in your house that they would come put in. And when you picked up the phone, you didn't get a dial tone. Waka said, yes, sir. And they physically placed the call. I mean, it was an astonishing national security effort to be sure we had good communications. You guys did, in the dark ages, a wonderful job.
We got time for one last question, and then we'll wrap it up.
Right, as a docent here, as a volunteer docent at the library, this opens up a whole new world for us in terms of sharing the president's legacy with our visitors here. But one of my questions is with regard to the comment Tom made relative to the satellite technology and Brian Lamb's comment in terms of cost. So my question is, the cost came down radically, obviously, but was the cost actually, the high cost previously, driven by fees that they were forced to pay, or was there something else going on that actually drove the cost so high, and the new satellite technology drove it low? Was it because they owned the distribution then, or how did that actually work? Thank you.
Henry, Tom?
Well,
Let me take one crack at it. The cost was very high because of the AT&T monopoly, number one. Number two, particularly with respect to the national TV broadcast networks, television, video takes up an awful lot of bandwidth. And putting that much bandwidth through a terrestrial wireless network, a microwave network, very, very expensive, compounded by the fact that it was monopoly pricing. So when satellites came along, you could get that bandwidth for national interconnection for a fraction of the cost, and also it was provided competitively.
Had these technologies available, as we've just heard. This goes back, over 50 years, and now they seem trivial, but at a cost, you can do it. The whole progress coming forward is making these things non-exclusive, having massive scale, and allowing competitive innovation to drive costs down. So people say it's science. Well, of course, science is along for the ride and is very, very helpful along the way. But the real institutional issue is how can you open a market and socially get the movement forward. Let me just read you a quote. This is so wonderful. In 1962, this is where we were, 1962, an economist who Tom Whitehead and others were listening to at the time, William Meckling, made a grand prediction. He said satellites will enable one to call anywhere in the world for 10 cents. And as I just texted my daughter in Korea for zero marginal cost before our panel started, you know that he was optimistic, but not optimistic enough. And all of our dreams of the day have been surpassed by what has enveloped with the competitive world that some people did more than imagine, but worked to make real.
Henry, Margaret, Tom, Chris, and Jeff, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, let's give them a round of applause.